You attack the evidence. What does the data show? And that, because that is where they're weakest. They cannot justify these programs on the basis of those two central claims of academic improvement and pro-social behavior. The data doesn't show it. We can observe it. It's in the research literature. They're not working. They're not preventing depression or anxiety. More kids are more depressed or anxiety, or report to be depressed or anxiety than ever before. And clearly it's not reflected in the academic proficiency scores.
Hello to all our moms, dads, and grands, and welcome back to M4L Academy. If you're new here, welcome to the school for parents, grandparents, and friends who want to defend and preserve liberty with a special focus on topics that impact kids, schools, and parental rights. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think it's safe to say we are all very aware of mental health. But what you may not be aware of is just how much money is spent on mental health programs and mental health supports in schools, which I have found extremely interesting as of late. We've seen a lot about fraud in the news, and I don't know that this is maybe exactly fraud, but it's really top of mind of where we're spending our money. And so we have a really special guest today who is going to help us unpack that. Chris Evans is a Washington State attorney with over 25 years of corporate law practice in the areas of venture capital, technology, and international transactions. In the area of education policy, he has been active in the promotion of school transparency and open meeting law compliance. In 2024, his successful petition against the Arizona Board of Behavioral Health Examiners for Administrative Procedures Act violations led to the reversal of a 21-year policy to blanket exempt school counselors from regulatory oversight by the board. He has contributed to school-based mental health policy research and legislative proposals for the Manhattan Institute and is published in the City Journal. You can follow Chris on Twitter, or X, the new Twitter, at A Legal Process. Welcome to the program, Chris.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Missy. Thank you. I feel a little bit of an imposter syndrome following Abigail Schreier. I got to admit that right away. But I'm very grateful and thankful for the opportunity to join this series, which is a really important series on school-based mental health programs.
I agree.
There's a lot to learn.
There is so much to talk about here. So why don't we start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what started your investigative journey into mental or school-based mental health programs, and what surprised you there?
Well, I suspect, like many of your viewers, I never really paid attention to schools until I got into a COVID lockdown situation with my schools here locally, and just to find out what was going to happen. Are they going to mask? Are they not going to mask? Are they going to quarantine? Are they not going to quarantine? I thought I better start paying attention to school board meetings. And so I was watching them live streamed on YouTube over a period of time, really just to inform myself about, how this is going to affect my life personally, because I did not care at all about what goes on in schools. So long as it was good, you buy in the best neighborhood that you can, and you get in the best school district, right? So during that process, there was a board meeting where the superintendent and the board got together, and they kicked out all the parents for complaining about some kind of curriculum adoption. Well, I had never thought about, what's a curriculum adoption? How is it adopted? How do they get their materials? How do they decide what's going to be taught in schools? And so I thought, as a corporate lawyer, I'm going to do what corporate lawyers do, and that's due diligence. And I looked into it and tried to figure out, why is there any controversy about the process of adoption? And it turns out there's actually a legal process in Arizona, where I'm currently residing, for school districts to adopt curriculum that requires open meeting law compliant committee meetings. That is, if they're going to introduce curriculum into a school and they're going to evaluate different curriculums, they have to hold meetings in public to do that. And they weren't doing that. It was all behind the scenes. It was, crazy. And that's why parents were getting upset. And so they made a values-based objection to certain curriculum material. And that's where I got into it. Then to file an open meeting law complaint with the Attorney General's office as part of that process addressing this adoption issue, I went back and I reviewed about 12 months, 18 months worth of school board meetings on YouTube. Whoa, that was mind blowing. Eventually, I filed the open meeting law complaint. Was very successful, and as a result of that complaint, across Arizona now, all districts are complying with the law to adopt curriculum in public, which is a great success. And I thought, well, I could just leave it there and move on and focus on my business. But in that process of going back through 12 to 18 months of board meetings, there was a new superintendent that was hired. And these conversations, I learned he was talking about supports. He was talking about policy revisions to establish restorative justice. He was hired with specific tasks to expand DEI-based programs in the district. And I just made a mental note of that at the time because it wasn't relevant to my transparency issues. But after I got out of that process, I went back and I looked at I didn't understand what was social emotional learning, what were supports. Actually, I never thought of support as being something that you would be plural with an S, and there's references to school counselors, the references to this concept, said very confidently, children, we know children cannot learn if they have emotional or social blockages that prevent them from acquiring material. And, these things stuck out to me because I never really, had heard learning and instruction framed in that way. And when the transing cases started appearing, where school districts were secretly transitioning children through gender identity dysphoria into assuming new identities, that really triggered something for me, because that is not just an innocuous protocol. That is a psychosocial intervention where we're changing the environment of the child to correspond to an identity that they are forming that's not congruent with their biological sex. And I thought, how would a school district, who ostensibly, and as far as I know, supposed to be teaching children and instructing children, how are they able to engage in this level of psychological intervention with children, much less, without parental consent or without a medical guidance, right? No doctor's note or anything like that. They're just doing it on themselves. So I dug into the legal filings for some of these cases. I don't know if you know Jane Coleman, Ron Coleman's wife, over at Legal Insurrection, but she was also following the cases in the news. And we were going through the legal filings and finding that in almost every one of these cases, a school counselor was tasked to kind of quarterback the support team for the child with gender dysphoria. And that seemed weird because I don't know how old you are, but I'm probably a little bit older. When I grew up, school counselors were called guidance counselors, number one. Mm-hmm. And you saw them maybe once or twice, when you were scheduling classes and when you were going to go to college or vacation or talk about after high school. And I thought, has something changed since I went to school in the 80s? And it turns out, there is. So when I looked at, well, what's the legal background? What's the legal process to become a school counselor, social worker, or school psychologist? They have legal categories for employment within a district. You have to be credentialed by the State Department of Education as a school counselor. Well, what does that entitle you to? Well, it turns out in Arizona and in most every other state, it's the same. State Department of Education will credential someone with a master's degree in school counseling and immediately authorize them to work in schools as school counselors. That is a very different career path and track in requirements and qualifications than someone to be a licensed professional counselor. A licensed professional counselor must have the same master's degree, but then they take an exam with the bar. For attorneys, it's a bar, but they have something similar for behavioral health, where they take an exam. They pass the exam. They go into a 2-year period of supervised practice by someone very experienced who can watch and monitor what they're doing. Okay. Once they become licensed, they're subject to certain mandatory ethical responsibilities that school counselors don't have. They're employees of the district, just like a teacher. They're not subject to the same ethical requirements. They're not subject to the same supervision requirements, but yet they're given an office with a door to meet a child one-on-one and talk about mental health. That was problematic. I thought that was problematic. As a lawyer, I'm always concerned, am I practicing outside my scope of practice? That's going to subject me to malpractice, right? Or, ethical violations for practicing outside your state. I'm licensed in Washington. I don't practice in Arizona or anywhere else. So once I realized that there's this dichotomy between what's a real counselor and what's a school counselor that is no longer a guidance counselor, I dug into the history. And this has apparently been something that's been going on for decades. It's been going back literally decades to where what you used to think as a guidance counselor is now been used as a shoehorn to bring in mental health programming, social emotional learning programming. And now there's this infrastructure built up to provide these mental health supports through the school counselor, through the school social worker and school psychologist, where when they get involved on a one-on-one or group therapy session, what they're doing in that school, they could not leave the school campus, go across the street, put up a shingle and start doing in private practice because they're not a licensed professional.
Oh my goodness.
Right?
Yeah.
It's concerning. It's very concerning. And I'm not even going to call it a gray area. Some people say overlapping regulations. It's not overlapping regulations. What the Department of Education's in any state, they're not qualified to supervise the provision of mental health services. They're not qualified. That's not what they do. They're not built for that. They just take people with a master's degree in school counseling and put them in a school district and say, go teach these kids or help these kids, help support these kids. And a whole infrastructure, as I say, has been built up around those programs that creates these. I'm not sure if your other speaker spoke about the multi-tiered systems of support programs.
So we've talked about that before in previous years.
Yeah.
We've touched on it in particular when we were talking about restorative justice. But let's take a second to unpack that a little bit, because I think that's an important thing.
Right.
Can you unpack that?
Unpack the multi-tiered systems of support. It's often called MTSS. So MTSS is a model of health service delivery. Okay, it was originally developed in the 70s for going into urban cities to screen people that might have mental health problems. And the idea was, if we get access to them early, we might be able to prevent certain recurring types of physical health problems or mental health problems in the inner cities, get them to the treatment that they need. That model became very effective, a framework for public services that was eventually applied to special education services in schools to identify students who might have learning disabilities and then bring them up to support. And it's called multi-tiered because at the bottom level is everybody. And this is when you might hear universal program, a universal school-based mental health program. That means everyone, all the cohorts are together kind of screened for needing service. If they need service, if they're identified as needing service, either through a referral by the teacher or a counselor or self-referral, they will go up to the second level at tier 2. In tier 2, that's called an intervention, a tier 2 intervention. A school counselor, a social worker, or a school psychologist will meet with them and talk about their issues. If they're unable to resolve the issues there, either through individual counseling or group therapy counseling, then they're referred out to an external provider who has an actual license, who is actually licensed to practice counseling or psychiatry, right? So this model of, it's kind of a pyramid with everyone at the bottom, 1, 2, and 3 tiers. That infrastructure has been built up over the last couple decades to apply to all education, special and general education. I sometimes joke, only half joking, that all kids are in special education now because they're all being monitored and watched if they need additional mental health support. Mental health
So
support.
you mentioned something kind of interesting there, and I want to take a quick second
Yeah.
and say how this just kind of recap where we got to, because I think this is fascinating. First of all, one of the most important things that I've heard you say is, and it I feel like there's a lot in this topic, a lot of
Yeah.
moments where I go, oh wow, yeah, that's so obvious. Why didn't I think
Right.
about that? But the idea that a guidance counselor that we knew is not
Yeah.
the school counselor that our kids are seeing today. And that's really important. The second thing that you mentioned that I think is also incredibly important is that the licensing that goes into school counseling versus what we would think of a real counselor, is very different. And that is important. I want to unpack that a little bit more later. But then these multi-tiered systems of support, that is fascinating to me because it if I'm understanding this correctly and what I've researched as well, then this is where they assume, because initially SEL is this idea that it's going to help kids who genuinely have really true social and emotional issues that are barriers to their ability to learn academically, which theoretically sounds important, that you would address that. And I'm sure there are some children that applies to, but MTSS and general SEL in school basically says everybody has some version of a trauma. And
Yeah.
so we're going to treat you all as traumatized, and you all need some version of mental health supports. Then we screen you out for further ones. Does that kind of summarize everything?
Yeah, that's basically correct. And the idea at the bottom level, where you may or may not be presenting with symptoms of a mental disorder or emotional or social issue, at that bottom tier, in tier 1, the universal level, you're going to be taught, this is what SEL does, right? You're going to be taught how to identify emotions, to self-regulate those emotions. And the idea is that, let's teach kids, let's educate them on what the mental health issues are, what out of the possible universe of mental health disorders, depression and anxiety, right? Let's help kids identify that in themselves so that they also learn how to self-report and also self-regulate and also become self-aware of what their emotional state is and how that may be affecting them. And through that identification process, we lose the stigma around mental health. And losing the stigma is actually something that has been very effective with these programs. No one has stigma anymore about claiming a
Oh
mental
goodness.
health problem.
No, no, kids are now putting it in their like LinkedIn bios that this is
Yeah,
my mental health problems, which is extremely
yeah.
disturbing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I think
no,
Abigail Schreier told you the same thing. It's become a status symbol to have a mental health disorder. So that part of the program has been very successful. People are not afraid of stigma anymore.
yeah.
But that's the idea at the universal tier 1 level, is that you self-identify, you start learning these concepts, right? So that you can learn how to regulate yourself and cope with stress. So whereas before you might have had a PE coach who, like me, fought in Vietnam and had a plate in his head, would say, Evans, suck it up. Life is tough and it's not fair. You better work harder. Instead, the message is, well, wait a minute. You might have some internalization of certain issues that you should talk to someone about, because that will affect your ability to perform in school and then perform in life. And so now suddenly you've psychologized what might be ordinary stress of growing up and anxiety around performing on tests and things. You've psychologized it into an issue to be treated by
That
someone
is
else.
really well stated. We've talked about this with other people as well, but I think that is a really good way to say it, because the other thing that I'm hearing, without officially putting the term to it, but this is what I would imagine is kind of the same thing, is like when you have the least little symptom of any sort and we go online to Google our symptoms and we end up on WebMD and everybody has cancer and
Yeah, I
we're
tell my
all going to
wife,
die,
don't do that. Yeah, yeah,
right? Yeah.
no, that happens
So
all the time. Yeah.
we see that kind of thing, I think, happen because I had heard of a friend of a friend, who they, I don't know, they had some sort of, I wonder, was it bipolar or no? It might have been bipolar 2 or something like
It's
that.
quite a
Uh,
diagnosis. Yeah, right. Yeah.
it was bipolar. What is manic depressive? Maybe I can't
Right,
remember which
right,
one it is.
right.
But they said that one of the symptoms that it was included was, um, you're sad sometimes, and
Mm.
I thought, well, golly, everybody's going to fall into have
Yeah,
qualifying for that one.
yeah, that's
And that
right.
was
You're
just one
human.
example. And they frankly, all of the symptoms were things that would have applied to everybody. So it
Right.
was just, it's an interesting thing, because then I think as a kid, it's just like you're saying, you're psychologizing normal emotions and normal experiences. Not saying that some kids don't have real,
That's right.
true mental health problems, but that doesn't mean that everyone does. I
That's
want
right.
to dive in real quick.
Sorry.
If you could explain to us a little bit more about, we've talked already a little bit about school-based behavioral and mental health programs. What exactly does that refer to? What's included in that?
Well, so as I'm saying, like maybe at the tier one level, the school might have a program about mindfulness. You might see that name somewhere. Mindfulness, teaching children how to be mindful in their words and in their actions by being considerate to others, being socially aware of their environment, and taking time out to reflect and contemplate your feelings. That's a mindfulness. Okay. Those types of programs would be considered like a mental health support at the universal level. Or if you get into at the tier two level with a kid that's clearly acting up, because now that the school has adopted mental health programs, they've also adopted restorative justice, where they feel that punishing a child for bad behavior is unfair because it's not their fault they have emotional issues. So they get rid of punitive behavioral standards, move them into a tier two individual group counseling session to talk about how to be more mindful in their thoughts by reflecting on their thoughts and their feelings. They're kids, right? They can't articulate what they're doing or what they're feeling because they're growing. But now they're being asked to contemplate them over a long period of time, and maybe even in public if it's in group therapy. Studies have shown that leads to rumination, right? Overemphasis on internal introspection, where you start to think, well, maybe I have a problem, right? Because I am acting up or something. But that can also trigger anxiety, right? But that would be an example of a type of SEL, mental health slash program intervention for a child with behavioral, let's say, behavioral maladaptions in class, right?
That makes sense. It's also
Yeah.
interesting to me because, so your background is not in education, neither is mine. Mine
No.
is all in the corporate world, business and
Yep.
technology, and
Yep.
even
Same world.
some bit of HR. And I think it's really interesting because these techniques were also introduced to adults at really the same time. And I was studying a lot about mindfulness in work and
Mm.
having deep work and all of these concepts that I think part of what contributed to this getting sold in schools and bought,
Mm.
the message being bought by parents, is they're also hearing it for themselves. And I will say, I think there's a certain level of it that does work for adults, and I think that's
Right.
the critical difference, is that
Because
it
you're
shouldn't.
intellectualizing it. Just now, you just intellectualized, right? You're mature enough to separate it from what is occurring in you, from
Yeah.
what might be helpful for other people.
Yeah.
That's a mature judgment you just made, and it's we shouldn't gloss over that. Can children as young as kindergarten and fifth grade and sixth grade and middle school, can they intellectualize it the same way? Or when a trusted adult with authority tells them they might have a problem, how do they react is very different than how you're going to react, or me, for sure. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
It's hearing you say it that way, having a trusted adult. And that's another important thing that people need to remember. Parents really need to remember that their kid, there's a real dichotomy or power differential
Yeah,
there. And it was never, I don't think it was ever really considered much of a bad thing. It was good to respect your teachers, etc. But in these kind of situations, it's really dangerous. So you
it
briefly
is.
mentioned that the idea of the data, of the outcomes of this.
Yeah,
So obviously, these programs are sold to be helping kids, improving behaviors,
right,
addressing that
right.
youth mental health crisis we're seeing. So what's the data actually showing?
Well, so just flip back. I mean, so one of these concepts that I heard as I'm exploring why they hired a new superintendent, he's changing all the policies and emphasizing supports and restorative justice and things like that. And I thought, where did this come from? This social emotional learning, and how did they take guidance counselors, vocational and college guidance counselors, and turn them into mental health workers that are unlicensed? Uh, and going back through the literature, because I want to go to the source material, it became very clear this CASEL or CASEL, I think some people say it's a collaborative for academic social emotional learning, plays a central role. It's out of Chicago. They kind of set the standard as what is an SCL compliant program. Well, in 2011, a professor in Chicago area, with a colleague that is also one of the co-founders of CASEL, published a report, all right, a study, a meta-analysis of programs out in school, multiple different programs in schools that had mental health support and social emotional learning. And he made two central claims that continue to this day. And this study is one of the most cited studies ever in every one of these programs. You still see his name. His name is Durlak, Professor Durlak. And in 2011, his study made the claim that SEL with appropriate mental health support will improve academic performance by 11 percentage points.
It's a lot.
And instill pro-social behavior. Okay.
Wow.
So you got two central claims. One, academics are going to improve 11 percentage points. Two, children will act better. They'll be more pro-social. No less maladaption to social norms. Those were the two central claims in 2011. Now, in 2011, if you remember, here's my legal side, we were still under the No Child Left Behind Act, which was an attempt by Congress to install accountability in schools, right? And their funding were going to get cut off, their test scores dropped and things. Well, that study comes out in 2011. CASEL calls it a landmark case in the history of SEL, and starts promoting the philosophy that education should take into effect, that children aren't going to learn unless they're emotionally and mentally healthily supported. That turns into ASA in 2015, Every Student Succeeds Act, during the Obama administration, which loosened that rigorous, right, accountability standards and introduced a concept of wellness. Okay. In the statute itself, literally, that the core academic focus was replaced with a concept of educational wellness. It just made up that term. They just made it up. Where now, and this teachers unions, we're very happy to hear this, and I posted about this before, because at the time teachers unions were praising ASA because they got to move away from the narrow focus on core academic subjects and treat the whole child. Okay. Boom, there's your concept, whole child. It goes to your question. So what become the whole child is now we're not going to look at a student as just a passive recipient of academic instruction. Now we're going to see a child that everyone has some psychological barriers to learning. And the role of the educator is to remove those barriers so that they can learn. Okay? It sounds great in theory, right? It's very well intentioned. But what we've seen now is anyone anyone see the 11 percentage point increase in academic scores? No. Nor have we seen the better pro-social behavior, right? So I think history has not been kind to those two central claims. And so the data at this point, the data is very clear in the research literature that these programs don't work. I could go through the list of researchers, but they're mostly in the UK, interestingly enough. We have out of Oxford and Bristol, University of Bristol, from researchers who are outside the educational establishment, applying medical grade level study controls on interpreting data, who have looked at these programs and looked at the research supporting these programs and said it's mostly bunk. Almost 85 to 90% of the studies used in the US to support these programs were biased research. They didn't use the right study controls or study designs, or they misreported or emphasized certain things in a study that probably was not the headline. And in these days now, in the state of the literature is, we know these programs do not improve academic performance, but it allows for reducing stigma, and it does increase self-reporting of symptoms. That's all in the academic side, and you can see that in the national test scores, right? No, I mean, nobody can contest now that we're talking decades, generational lows in proficiency scores. The second central claim about better behavior, we can observe that ourselves. The number one reason teachers quit is because they don't have control of their classrooms, right? And kids are acting up. So whatever they're doing is not working. And the research pretty much shows these programs meant to prevent mental illness, prevent depression, anxiety, and acting up can actually harm some students because it makes them psychologize everyday experience and internalize. And instead of pushing through into a resilient individual who overcomes obstacles, they ruminate on the possibility they may have a mental health issue to deal with. And I think the state of the art right now on mental health programs is how to minimize the harms. If mental health programs were subject to the same controls as, say, a pharmacological product, your meds, right? Where they have to test the drug before it goes on the market and see how many people are harmed. Well, there's a certain threshold. If it harms too many people, they wouldn't release it into the market. I think that's where we are with mental health programs. The harms are known. Some kids, when they go to a mindfulness class, they come out thinking, gosh, I may have a problem. And then they ruminate it, and it makes them sadder and more depressed. And we don't need that. And that's not what schools are for, right? Schools are for learning and instruction. And we don't see these two central claims of academic improvement or pro-social behavior. We don't observe it ourselves as parents. We don't observe it actually in the science, good science, rigorous science, okay? Not the science that comes out of ed schools somewhere, right? That is touting these programs or wants to sell you, like Casel wants to sell you very expensive trainings. Okay, yeah. So I maybe have diverted away from your question a little bit, but
No, I think
lots to cover.
that was it. That was it, addressing like what does the data actually show, and you're correct that we'd previously interviewed Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath, and he talked about, and I believe said it before the Senate as well, that this is the first generation where we actually see a drop in IQ. So not even just test scores, but an actual drop in IQ from because every previous generation, the children are smarter than their parents, and
that's right.
That's kind of terrifying to me, especially with the introduction of AI and
Yeah,
the many concerns about that, which we don't need to cover right now.
right.
But yeah, so
Well,
you definitely addressed it with the data.
I have a hypothesis about that, and it goes to the money question, which the
Okay.
kind of the second area that I would
That was,
really want your viewers to walk away from this meeting is the money
yeah.
question. So there is no way to really track how much we spend on SEL and mental health programs in the US. Like, because they're not required to report it, oh, this is an SEL and mental health program on their financial statements. They use all kinds of accounting codes. But all those districts report and use these accounting codes that go into the state, that go and is reported to the census, U.S. Census, as well as the National Center for Education Statistics, where they take the raw data and then they put it into a common set of definitions. And so part of those definitions are classroom spending, right? Everybody has heard classroom spending and they want to increase classroom spending, but not all classroom spending is the same. There are certain categories of classroom spending. One is instruction, and that's the big one because that pays for teachers, teacher salaries, and benefits. It also pays for instructional materials and textbooks and clubs, all the things that are front facing with the student in the classroom, and what we would probably consider kind of your traditional academic experience when you're going through school. That's instructional classroom and spending. But there's also this other category. It's called student support services. These are non-academic student support services. And those we can track. So I use it as a proxy. Student support services is always smaller than instructional spending, but it pays for counselors, social worker, psychologists, and the mental health programs that are being implemented in the schools. And now, some of these, like particularly school psychologists, they perform services for special education, but not all of them, right? So the school counselors may just be doing general ed. They may not be doing special ed. But that category of student support could be as much, we have to guesstimate because we can't extract exactly, but we have to guesstimate about 50%. As much as 50% could be general education. And student support services nationwide, and here's the shocking number. In 2023, which is the last year available data, 2023, $52.6 billion was spent
Wow.
nationally. That's
Holy
like
cow.
3 aircraft carriers or something on student support
Wow.
services. Okay, this is an extraordinary sum, and it's eye popping, but you need context, you need perspective. I've dug into the data on spending because that is available from the census website. Anyone can download, and since 2022, or excuse me, 2002, when we adopted these categories of accounting to report, how schools are spending their money, student support services has gone up 3 times the rate as instructional spending. Okay,
Wow.
they're both classroom spending, but one goes to instruction, one goes to student support. And so, although instructional spending is up about 99% since 2002, student support services has gone up 172%. 172%. That's 3 times the rate of increase as instruction. That's not all special ed because we don't have 3 times the rate of special ed kids. There is some data showing autism diagnoses are up, but for the most part, you're looking at 10 to 15% of special ed as a percentage of the population. That's where these programs reside in the accounting books, the financial statements, student support services. So when you look at instruction going up, but student support services going up 3 times the rate, now you're talking as a percentage, okay? Student support services used to be in 2002, 4 to 6% of what a district would spend on instruction. Okay, it doesn't sound like much. It sounds very nice,
No.
sound reasonable,
Yeah.
4 to 6%. Now, the national average is 12%.
Wow.
Okay, so that and it's that's just national average. There's school districts that I know that are spending 20% of their operational spending in the classroom on student support, 20%. So that means 20 out of every $100 going to instruction, you got 20 going to student support services. So what does it tell you? Right? We know that you get when you invest, you get what you are investing in. If you're investing in non-cognitive outcomes, you get more of those non-cognitive outcomes. So if you're investing in instruction, you're going to get more of the cognitive outcomes. So, this level of spending is just unbelievable. California alone, and there's 20 states. There's 20 states that spend over $1 billion on student support services a year, including my current state of Arizona, which has a minuscule budget compared to these other states, but they're still spending $1 billion on student support services.
Wow.
And when you look at that ratio of student support to instruction, and it keeps going up, now cross that with academic proficiency scores. It's a correlation. It's not necessarily causation, but it's a unique data point that as schools are spending more on these programs and less on instruction, less on teachers and instructional materials, they're obviously going to affect academic proficiencies. Common sense, right? So that's my hypothesis, is that schools are just outrageously spending, and that was accelerated through COVID, because if you know the was it the ESSER funds, the COVID relief funds, and under the Biden administration allocated $190 billion to schools that could be used for mental health, and many schools used it for mental health and for creating more mental health counselors, and because it had programs to sponsor kids to go into graduate schools and study mental health. That's a lot of money, Missy. I mean, we're a rich country, but now with declining enrollment, with declining proficiency scores, everything should be on the table now. Everything. And as I learned, in my open meeting law and transparency work at my school district, just on curriculum adoptions, do not underestimate the willingness and ability of school district officials to hide from you what's really going on in their schools. Don't estimate.
That's a really good point.
Yes, yeah. Well, but they're the experts, and we have to defer to experts, and they have a way of making parents feel like you're stupid, you don't know. Well,
Yeah.
so here's my advice. I'm glad you asked the question and framed it the way you did, which is, what's the data say, right? That is an evidence-based argument. It's not a values-based argument. When you go to your school district and you make a values-based argument, well, SEL and mental health, you're transing all the kids, right? You're teaching values that I don't believe in. And those are value-based, arguments. They're going to disregard you. I mean, they're openly hostile to those values. So you have to assume that. You attack the evidence. What does the data show? And that, because that is where they're weakest. They cannot justify these programs on the basis of those two central claims of academic improvement and pro-social behavior. The data doesn't show it. We can observe it. It's in the research literature. They're not working. They're not preventing depression or anxiety. More kids are more depressed or anxiety, or report to be depressed or anxiety than ever before. And clearly it's not reflected in the academic proficiency scores. So when we make an argument to our districts, we be evidence-based. That's the weakest point for them. The programs aren't working. They cost a lot of money. Why? In an era of declining enrollment and budget cuts, are you spending more money on ineffectual programs who, by the way, circling back to one of my original points about being unlicensed by a state regulatory agency, mental health counselors, mental health workers in schools are not licensed to diagnose or treat any mental condition. That would be the unauthorized practice of behavioral health. And in most states, that's a felony. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So what are they? They're not licensed to diagnose or treat your child with psychotherapy, or diagnose with your child with any types of recognizable, you said your friend might have manic depression or something like that. Those are diagnosed. Those are big words. and they have legal significance when you're talking about the practice of behavioral health. But mental health workers in schools are not licensed to diagnose or treat anything. They are essentially life coaches. Okay, have been known to engage in a little hyperbolic, argumentation, but I think it helps to drive this point home that they're not licensed to diagnose or treat a child. If your child is having difficulties, go see a professional. Do not rely on the free mental health life coach from the school district, because life coaches, they're not subject to regulations. But that's basically what they are.
And you've called out though something, and I want to go back to the data argument, but I'll come back to that in a second. So you've
Sure.
called out something though elsewhere, which in so many of these cases that you were looking into, that and which we have seen in the news, that even when parents put in place the request that if you're going, I've seen many of those in California and elsewhere, where parents specifically said, we want to be involved in any conversations that you have for psychosocial, emotional conversations with our child. And the schools just disregard it. And what sort of, I know what I would say to that, to parents, but what would you suggest parents do? Like, how can they fight that? What direction should they go when that's happening?
So this is a tough one. Straight up, it differs by state. In California, at 12 years old, the left proponents of these programs, the proponents of these programs have successfully changed the law to lower the age of consent for mental health service to 12 in California. 12. You may not even be in puberty yet, right? In which case, that provides cover for a school to say, no, this child is self-reporting an issue. And that's a mental health issue. Now it's a health, because schools are now clinics with classrooms, right? They've identified this child is now self-reporting something they've identified as a potential mental health concern. So they have a right under California law to mental health counseling. Look, and I get this all a lot, because it's similar in Seattle and where I'm from. You have to. It starts at home. Part of loving your child is protecting your child and to protect your child from known and unknown dangers. Let me tell you, schools are not safe places when it comes to mental health programming. They're not. And so if you tell a district, I'm opting out of everything, you will never have another, put it in writing, put it in a letter, don't tell the teacher, go straight above. You have to fight the way you can, in any way you can. But if you're in a state where proponents of these programs have already successfully lowered the age of consent for mental health, you're in a pickle.
Well, I think your story is really actually quite valuable, because you, as I had heard it, you were, you said it already, that you really weren't overly concerned with what was going on in the schools, which is, frankly, that's very much my story. I had a perfectly fine experience with school. I was a very good student. I'm not necessarily the most competitive when it comes to sports, because I'm not good at sports, but I'm very good at academics. So I am a great student. That was never a problem for me. And I just applied my experience in school to my children's experience, which is very much not the way that it was. And so that was a real shocker to me, as it sounded like it was for you. And you actually left. You went to a place where you took your kids to what you believe is a better place, and you are making a better place, have been making.
That's right. I left the Seattle area and went to Arizona, right? Thinking it would be better. Yeah, it was. Yeah. I'm very happy I did so. And, but I had to, because somewhere around 2016, my son was coming home, and my son is biracial. His wife is, my wife is Persian, and he's dark skinned. And he was coming home and saying the teachers in his middle school, 6th grade, was saying he can't study white authors. And this is the first time he was forced to consider racial identity within this biracial marriage and within his own self-image. And I just that's one illustration of some of the questions he was coming home with, and I thought, what's the programming going on here? And our daughter, who would be a few years behind him, was getting close to that age where, in Washington State, I think at 12, they can take a child out of class and perform abortions.
Oh
Yeah,
my goodness.
and bring her back to school, and perfectly legit because they have the ability to consent.
Oh,
So we saw that coming on the horizon. Oh, I know it's astonishing. But the thing is, parents like you and me, we didn't know any of this, and it's been decades of infrastructure in the law and infrastructure in the schools to build this, right? And they think they're heroes.
I know there's a number of things that we had initially planned on talking about, but we hadn't quite gotten a chance to. So why don't I hand it to you for a second? And then I want to wrap up with, I'll come back to it just as a teaser, but I'm going to come back to how you talked about how parents can respond, like how to approach this. But we have all sorts of stuff we wanted to get to. So why don't you share us some insights?
With how parents should respond.
No, with some of the
Yeah.
other things that you've seen. So, like
Oh,
the financial that you have
okay.
looked at, like what concerns do you have for these universal mental health screenings, those kind of things.
Okay. Well, one thing I really wanted to emphasize, um, there is reason for optimism because we have seen so much of the research literature now establishing, clearly documenting the potential harms from these mental health interventions in schools, particularly in schools, right? Often performed by unqualified people. We're seeing the research literature well established enough now that there's two recent developments that I think give us a ray of hope that maybe the tide is turning. Maybe it was just a fad. The first one was in the United Kingdom, in UK. The UK Ministry of Defense, excuse me, Department of Education sponsored a study to go back and look at some of their mental health programs and are they effective? And has recently, last November, published two very important reports concluding that these programs, like mindfulness and coping strategies, were not effective at preventing depression or anxiety, and in fact produced harms, and recommended against the Department of Education in the UK and against renewing the grants that funded them. And then also last year, at in the U.S. Congress, the Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan organization of research scientists that produce publications for consumption by Congress and the public on a nonpartisan basis. And they're mandated by statute. They're maintained by the Library of Congress. They're mandated to be balanced, fair and balanced. What are the arguments for? What are the arguments against? And last year, the CRS produced a report, it's available online, that says, school-based mental health programs might be causing harm. And it was chaos. It was tepid. It wasn't as assertive as I am in my claims, or as really as the research literature I think justifies. But for the first time, we saw a government-sponsored report informing Congress, yeah, proponents claim academic improvement. We haven't seen it, and there's very little to weak evidence that it improves or prevents depression and anxiety in children, which are the two most common concerns with children. And that was the first time that's ever happened, right? So there maybe, these things take time to work through the literature, which I encourage your viewers like you to be data-based and evidence-based in the way you frame these disputes and these arguments and advocate for your position. When you go to a school board meeting, attack the evidence and demand evidence for these claims that they make for these programs, because they're not cheap. They are expensive. And I've seen over the last year or two where schools try to cut programs related to mental health, that there is a special interest group that will fight it very voraciously and publicly. They like having their free mental health support, Well, right, and the response to that is, well, no, no, no. I care about children. I want them to have true, evidence-based psychological interventions that these school staff are not qualified to do. If they need professional help, go to get professional help. But this school district is in decline and declining academic proficiency scores, and has limited budgets, and we can't do all things for all people, right? Based on the research, based on the science, they're not improving academics, and they're not improving, kids' behavior. Teachers are quitting. So we want our schools to refocus on their core mission of educating children, and that requires, an argument. Yeah.
I have to say that, honest to goodness, is exactly what I was going to ask. Because before, when you were speaking to the way that parents should consider attacking or bringing up the issue, as opposed to just going in on the values difference, because that is a big thing. That's even if that is, honestly, even if that is the most important thing to the parents, I would encourage trying to do something that removes the emotion, because it just makes it an easier conversation. But that is exactly what I was going to ask, is because I would be afraid it would be the same response that we've heard elsewhere,
Yeah.
where, oh, but we just haven't thrown enough money at it. We need to throw more money at it and spend
Right.
more time on it.
Right.
That I
Right.
could see the concern. So it sounds like you're saying just keep coming back to this with the simple response that the data shows it's not working.
Yes.
So
That's
is that
right.
fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you follow me on Twitter, on X, I regularly post on updates and research, from some people that I think, have clearly established the fact they're not working. And I can supply you data, and if someone reaches out to me, I'm happy to share my studies and research.
That's awesome. So if parents were to go into their school districts and ask, or maybe this is the first time they're hearing about social emotional learning or
Yeah.
screenings, or that their school might have a school counselor that is
Right.
implementing behavioral health programs, if they could only ask a few questions, what should they ask?
Is it opt in or opt out?
Mm,
That's the first one, right? Will I be notified prior to a session with the counselor, even if they're speaking to all the class, right? It is my right as a parent to know what the curriculum is and when certain subject matter is being presented. So yeah, insist on your rights to get that. Know whether you can sign a form that you opt out of any mental health counseling, or social emotional learning lessons. Uh, Go to the website, find it. If you don't see it, send an email, call, pick up the phone and call someone to find out, is it opt out or opt in? Because if it's opt out, until they hear from you, they will assume you've consented, right? If it's opt in, then, and schools hate opt in, so chances are it's going to be opt out, because schools hate opt in because parents don't return the forms, right? And then that limits their ability to increase the number of kids that are exposed to these lessons. So that's the number one. You got to find that out, and write your letters explaining what you're prepared, when not prepared to do, and what you let your child be exposed to.
I think that
That's
is
what.
really,
Yeah.
yeah, that summarizes it extremely well. The opting out, opting in, that's one of
Yeah.
the most important things that parents can do. One of the other things that you've done so much work with, that encouraging transparency and enforcing transparency. That's a really important point that I think a lot of parents may not even realize, that their school districts aren't following that. So what practical steps would you recommend parents take if they want to try to enforce more transparency in their schools?
Get to know three things. One, what is the process to go on to the website of the school district and request public records? Find out how to access public records, and because by law, as a government entity, the schools must produce their records regarding your child or whatever things that are going on in the school district. subject to certain exceptions. Two, know what is your state's open meeting law. That is, when must the school board hold a meeting in public, and when can they do it behind closed doors? When can the superintendent hold meetings? I mean, this is with his staff or whomever in private versus in public. That's open meeting law. The third is FERPA. I mean, it's a federal law, FERPA, FERPA. And that regulates the use of data by your school of your child, and for privacy protection. And FERPA allows school districts. The idea is to keep your data in the school and it's secure, but there are exceptions. One of which is some of these softwares vendors that they use to, for example, in the mental health and social emotional learning context, these vendors like Panorama or whatever, that will rate your child according to their behavior, right? That data is going to a third-party server somewhere at another company under an exception to the FERPA laws that allows for these outsourcing of certain school functions. We don't know where that data is going. You want to become familiar with FERPA to know what your rights are to get that data back, right? So those are three things for transparency. And then, of course, there's no rules saying you can't ask your district for more transparency than the law allows, right?
That's great. I think that's an excellent point. I think the school districts, I will caution most parents, if you're new to all of this, school districts don't typically make it easy to figure out the process. It's generally relatively confusing, but you can dig into it and find out. The last question I want to ask real quick, because I think you can probably speak to it quickly. Why would there be a benefit? Like, can you summarize? Why would there be a reason for a private meeting, a behind closed doors meeting, and not just have it all out in the open? Because, I mean, it's schools. It feels like that should all be something that should be in the open. Why would there be stuff that's behind closed doors?
You mean at the school level or at the individual, like mental health level? At the school?
More at the school level, yeah.
Well, you can guess, and I'm sure your viewers can guess. Opening the workings and deliberations of a school board to the public allows the public to know what topics are considered, what topics are not considered. It knows how some members may vote based on their response and their engagement with that topic, and then how some others will veto. So it's important that be transparent, but it also subjects them to criticism. And so there is a tendency, and it slows down. Complying with open meeting laws is burdensome. They have to file an agenda in advance, which means someone has to decide what the agenda is, post it in advance, and then at the meeting they can only discuss items on the agenda. They can't discuss off-agenda items, right? If they're subject to open meeting law, and then they have to produce minutes, right? So there's a certain burdensome process with complying with open meeting law that districts want to avoid. And we see that even now with school closures. They want school closure conversations to occur in private. They don't want the public to know which schools may be targeted for closure. Right.
That really helps. And I appreciate you saying that. 'Cause sometimes I think that people, if you're not super familiar with us, it may be like, okay, well, who cares? I mean, I have meetings with my boss that we don't want everyone with us. And so it helps to realize what is going into all this. So
you might miss your opportunity to jump in and engage a public official, right? A duly elected official. You miss your chance because you don't know that what topic was possibly being discussed. So you miss your chance to engage in the political process.
Which really the school boards are pretty much about as close to grassroots and ground level as you can get in engaging
That's the theory.
in the political process, right?
That's the theory, yes.
Yeah, it is. And I know I always knew I wanted to be involved in the political landscape in some way, not as a politician. I'm not interested in that, but I've always been very aware of everything. I never thought that I would be paying attention to school board meetings ever.
Oh, me either. Me
Yeah.
either. I was thinking corporate mergers and
Yeah.
venture capital investments, and that's a lot more interesting. And here I am, but because I care about my kids, right?
Yes.
Now, my kids have already graduated, but it's time now. I've reached a point where I need some younger generation to step up, and let's not reinvent the wheel. Here you
Yeah.
have a resource. Use me,
Yes.
because I want them to engage the next generation of young parents to be aware, because you need to
And
be aware.
where can people find you to engage with you and follow your
So,
work?
so on X, I'm a legal process, and on Substack, I have a Substack called Further Thoughts.
Ooh,
It's on my X, and I publish there sometimes. And I
awesome.
continue to work with Carolyn Gorman at Manhattan Institute and City Journal, and hopefully we'll be publishing more works there as we go along. So,
Well, wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you so much for this excellent conversation. And
Oh,
I
thank
am
you.
hoping that we'll be able to entice you back to talk a little bit more about the whole school, whole child program, because that is a crazy thing in and of itself. But we'll save that for a future conversation.
That's right. It's a whole philosophy of education. Right.
It,
Hopefully
it
discredited by this point.
hopefully seems like
Yeah.
it's disappearing. Well, thank
Thank you,
you
Missy.
again.
I enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Wow, yet another time we find out that school today is not like when we were kids. Did you know that the guidance counselors have morphed into school counselors who do not have the counseling training you'd expect and are not even licensed? How much is your school spending on mental health supports? How about academics? Have you seen the promised 11% gains? Chris reminded us that every parent wants pretty much the same thing for kids to be safe, supported, and able to learn well. But as he pointed out, good intentions are not enough, especially when schools start layering in programs that can blur the line between education and emotional management. Once you start calling normal childhood stress a problem to be managed, the school has somehow moved into a role that belongs first and foremost to parents. And of course, it's all presented as caring when in reality, it's expanding school power and influence while simply not delivering the results. Parents deserve to know what's being taught, who's providing it, and whether these programs are truly helping kids or just creating more dependency, more labels, and a never ending spending cycle. So here's the challenge, parents. Don't assume your school is being transparent just because it sounds nice and compassionate. Ask questions, read the agenda, pull the policies, because if we don't pay attention now, we may wake up one day and realize the school has been redefining childhood right in front of us. If you found this episode helpful or informative, please hit like and subscribe and share with another parent or friend so we'll all be educated and equipped on these topics as we build more engaged citizens, not enraged activists. As James Madison said, the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only true guardian of liberty. And that is the mission of M4L Academy. Class dismissed.